Okay, welcome everyone to ICOM Canada's first webinar of the year and to the International Achievement Award. We are very, very pleased to welcome the Dr. Victoria Dickenson to accept this award from the ICOM Canada board. And she and Sascha Priewe, who is our vice president, are going to have a chat about many different things. I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. So we would like to acknowledge that we occupy land that belongs to Indigenous peoples. Understanding that we live and work on various traditional territories of Indigenous peoples across what is now known as Canada, we encourage all members to consider their specific relationship to this land and to the Indigenous peoples who have lived there since time immemorial. We also acknowledge the history of these lands has been tainted by poor treatment and a lack of respect for the Indigenous peoples who call them home. We recognize that this land acknowledgement is just one imperfect step towards decolonization. It is a reminder of a larger commitment to challenging ourselves to expand our understanding of this legacy of colonialism and to do the work necessary to disrupt and dismantle it now and for the future. I acknowledge that the land that I am meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So I'm going to do a short introduction of Victoria. Dr. Victoria Dickenson is one of a handful of truly significant museologists in Canada. As a fellow of the Canadian Museums Association, she has served the community with distinction and passion for over 4 decades. As an educator, scholar, and curator, Victoria has contributed books and articles that have advanced the museum field in Canada. One of the hallmarks of Victoria's life in museums is its international dimension. She has established a network of international contacts through a number of projects, including most recently the Gwillim Project that centers around the life and work of 2 English sisters in early 19th century Madras, today Chennai, India. Using collections of detailed drawings and paintings that documented landscape and ecology, birds, animals, insects, and fish, flowers, and trees, Victoria has engaged with collections at McGill University and the South Asian Collection in Norwich, England, and with scholars and museums in India to undertake exhibitions and publications that will bring these treasures out of the archival vaults for the benefit of audiences in Canada, the United Kingdom, and India. It is a pioneering project which, when added to Victoria's long-standing international profile and her career as a museum scholar and administrator, makes her uniquely deserving of ICOM Canada's recognition with the International Achievement Award. Victoria, do you want to do your land acknowledgement now?
First of all, Elka, thank you for your very kind words. And I'd also like to thank those who nominated and supported me for this award, which I found surprising, but also immensely gratifying. So thank you first. I'm coming to you today from Newfoundland, and I respectfully acknowledge these are the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, who are now sadly gone. And there is a long story in that and a long history in Newfoundland now being acknowledged. Uktahumguk, and I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, the name for the island of Newfoundland, is the unceded territory of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq. So it is a privilege to be here and to be speaking to you today from the edge of the North Atlantic.
Okay, and I'm also going to introduce Dr. Sascha Priewe. Dr. Sascha Priewe is the Associate Vice President, Strategic Initiatives and Partnerships at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto and the Vice President of ICOM Canada. Sascha is also a co-founder of the North American Cultural Diplomacy Initiative, NACDI, cross-appointed as an associate professor in the Department of the History of Art at the University of Toronto, and an affiliated associate professor in cultural studies at Queen's University. He is also a senior fellow of Massey College, a research fellow of the USC Centre on Public Diplomacy, and serves on the Council of the Ontario Museum Association. He holds a DPhil in archaeology from Oxford University and was a curator of Chinese and Korean collections at the British Museum prior to joining the RON. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Elka, and welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. As with Elka, I'll be joining you from Toronto, and I'll join her in her land acknowledgement here. It's such a pleasure to see you all, and I would like to especially extend a warm welcome to previous International Achievement Awards holders. Some of you are in the room. Thank you for your continued excellent work at the global intersection of museums, and especially Victoria, congratulations on this award. And I'm looking forward to this conversation because I think we have a lot of talk about, and we'll be chatting back and forth, let's say for the next half hour, a bit more. And if you have any questions, just make yourself known by raising the hand or putting something in the chat. We don't need to wait until end of Victoria might chat, and I'm sure we might be footnoting ourselves quite a lot and going off trail quite a bit here and there. So please just raise your hand or put something in chat, and we'll get to you pretty quickly. And Victoria, Elka mentioned the Gwillim Project, and actually I think we should be talking about this a bit more because it sounds like a fantastic project and a tremendous achievement that's broken new ground. Would you mind saying a bit more about that?
Sure.
Yeah,
well, the Gwillim Project began, when I moved back to Montreal in 2016, I became very involved with McGill University with the Rare Books and Special Collections, particularly what's called the Blackerwood Natural History Collection, which is where the area of my own research work in history of natural history. And I discovered these, not discovered them, they were there and they were cataloged, but no one had really looked at them. These 200 drawings, watercolors by two sisters, Elizabeth Gwillim and Mary Simons. They had gone to India in 1801 when Elizabeth's husband, Sir Henry Gwillim, was appointed to the Supreme Court. And what was very interesting is as I looked at these watercolors of Elka, as Elka mentioned, of fauna and flora, I realized that there was also correspondence about them from the librarian, and I dug a bit more and I discovered that not only did the McGill hold Elizabeth Gwillim's material, but Mary Simons' album of watercolors of people and places was in Norwich at the South Asian Museum, and the correspondence of both sisters was in the British Library. So the project became to build a digital archive and to create a digital archive so that an international network of scholars could access it. So that was pretty exciting. And we started that over 3 years ago. And what was wonderful for me is I discovered some people had already been working on the Gwillims, a professor at New York University in the States, the curator in Norwich, but also Subramanya, who is an ornithologist in India. And through them, we started to build this network of people, which in the UK, in the US, in Canada, and India, to look at this collection. And that has been the most enriching part of the Gwillim Project, was the building of the global network. And the small network that started with about a dozen people grew exponentially because we took advantage of the platform we're using now. We took advantage of Zoom because our project debuted really with COVID, the arrival of the global pandemic, and our plans for meeting became virtual. And we ended up developing a webinar series, much like the ICOM webinar, on the Gwillim Project, in which people spoke and came to us from literally a large number of people from India, but also UK, US, and Canada. And we spoke on topics as varied as the dress of the Gwillim sisters, of the bird paintings, of the work of the courts in India, the food the Gwillims ate, the plants that they collected. So it was an incredibly rich experience for everyone. And we now have a network of over 50 people who have been researching the Gwillim Project for the last 3.5 years. We developed a website for it, thegwillimproject.com, which you can access. We hired research students at McGill. We benefited from a social sciences and humanities research grant, a partnership development grant. We were able to hire students who also did incredible work on the project. And it's really become something that has very much a life of its own. The people who have committed to it have spread the news through other people, and we've been asked to speak at a number of different conferences in the US and in the UK. And so as a result, and we have a book coming out with McGill Queen's Press next year with contributions from the network. So a very, very rich project that took advantage of a collection in Canada, a global network of expertise, and new technologies to make the research project possible.
Very exciting, and of course, this project also draws very heavily, or is rooted in very much in the colonial context in which the works were produced, and which the Gwillims experienced and had a part in and benefited from. And how has this formed a part of or influenced the kind of conversation that you had with international collaborators? How has your project advanced the dialogue on these type of questions?
Well, that's been really extremely interesting, particularly with our Indian collaborators, because they experienced a different kind of colonialism from what we think of as what took place in Canada. And so the discussions around how can we use this material? These are two English sisters who come from, by the way, from Hereford. They're middle-class women. The father was a builder. And actually, one of the interesting stories is the father was a builder and architect, and was quite well known in the time. When he died, his wife took over the business in partnership with another sister who stayed in London. And so there's a story right there about women's enterprise, which you never hear much about. But thanks to the letters, we were able to discover much more about this family network. But how do we look at the works of two English sisters commenting and depicting life in Madras in 1801, 1808? What was clear from our colleagues in India was there was not much documentation on this period. This is called the colonial Raj. It's pre the British Raj. The East India Company's in place. After 1799, they defeat Tipu Sultan, the last sort of ruler in the area. They set up their government there. But it's a time of great flux. And the sisters are themselves very sympathetic observers, sympathetic towards India and Indians. Elizabeth Gwillim herself learns Telugu, which is like Tamil. Telugu is still spoken in the area of South India. And so she's able to converse with people. She writes down the names of plants and animals. She engages with local people. And so this became very interesting. Could the scholars in India use her observations, the observations of this English woman? Did they make any sense? So what was exciting for us was that the scholars in India looked at her material and were able to see it with new eyes. And they also, I think what's interesting for me is it taught me so much about how difficult it is to see differently. I know a fair bit about natural history in England in the 18th and 19th century, and I was really interested in that aspect of the project. But what I learned from my colleagues was to look behind the English vision of the natural history of the world and see how others saw it. So we looked a lot at how people saw how the people living in Madras also looked at their environment, the geography, the natural history, and the architecture of Madras in that period. So yeah, it was incredibly enriching for all of us, I think. And it also brought into light too the work of South Asian scholars living in North America and how they saw this material versus how how Indian scholars living in India saw it too. So there was dialogue in a variety of ways around how do we think about using material, which we could define as, does it have a use at all? And the answer is yes, but it has to be used from different contexts and different backgrounds, and much can be discovered from it, but you can't just take it at face value.
Yeah, I always very much enjoy myself when these type of object-based engagement and draw out all these various tangents and examinations that then change yourself as a researcher in the process. And I think that's part of the enriching work. And I actually was about to pivot to looking a bit at the nature of the work during the pandemic, but there's a question by Catherine Kolnich that I'd like to run with at this point, and I'll read it out to you. Much of the international museological work is done either by large museums or universities and funded by SSHRC. What advice would you have for smaller institutions and/or independent museologists who are interested in conducting work internationally?
Well, I think SSHRC has been really helpful. I mean, the alliance with the university allows you to access funding, and I think that's important. So I think independent scholars can ally themselves with the university. I'm a professor of practice at McGill. I'm on faculty, but I'm not part of the regular faculty. And I think there's a real opportunity for scholars independent researchers to ally themselves, even with smaller universities. Because I think this kind of global work, these kind of global networks, and this is where the technology comes in, Sascha, are really the ability to engage with people from literally all over the world through this kind of new technologies of exchange of information is enormous. So that I would suggest that smaller institutions and independent researchers allying themselves with local universities, not just with the larger universities or larger museums, there's real opportunity there. And I know that I've been looking at some of my colleagues. So we've also been looking at natural history in North America more recently and allying ourselves with smaller institutions in North America. So I think there's a huge opportunity because, quite frankly, making the material, the archives available digitally, which we did in the case of the Gwillim Project. So all of it was available digitally. Meant that people anywhere can look at this material and contribute to the conversation. And that is indeed what happened. Yeah. We had people from all over India engaged in the project, including people who are independent researchers.
Yes, thank you very much for the question, Catherine. And I agree, Victoria, it's really important about that university alignment is really key to it because of the way in which the funding structure works in Canada. When I was in the UK, I was very much used to the fact that as a museum, even relatively smaller museums, you could actually apply for funding independently to the research councils. That, unfortunately, is not the case here. So it's always important to bring to bear a university relationship, university partnership. And usually what people on our side of the equation of that partnership bring to bear is the access to collections and the access to networks that some of the partners at universities do not have actually access to. And that's where often the partnership develops most fruitfully.
Mm-hmm. I should say too, I mean, we had a number of museum partners in the Gwillim Project, the ICOM Museum, for example, and we lent material to the ICOM for an exhibition, which is now there. So there's some of Elizabeth Gwillim's bird paintings at the ICOM right now, in conversation with paintings from India from around the same period and a bit earlier. So looking how were birds depicted? How do you think about natural history? And what is very exciting is in the research to that is to find these earlier antecedents of conversation between Europe and India going back 200-300 years in looking at natural history. So this is not a new conversation. This sharing of how do we think about the natural world? How do we decide how we look at species is part of an ongoing conversation, certainly in India, that has gone back with Europe, that's gone back 500 years. And I think that's been really interesting. But also the South Asian Museum in Norwich, I have to tell you, is a museum with 4 people. It's not a big museum. And they were able also to access a Carnegie, as a result of our involvement, they accessed a Carnegie Mellon grant, which allowed the curator of the museum to hire additional help so that he could spend more time on the research for the project. So I think there's lots of opportunities to leverage these relationships, particularly for smaller institutions.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier that you're diving more deeper into natural history collections. And that's, as I said, that's your next project, right? That you're building on the work that you've done through Gwillim, that which will, of course, leave a huge legacy. You're now diving deeper into those materials.
Well, I think one of the images, and I'm sorry, I'm not sharing screen with you, but one of the images, if you look at the website, you'll see it, that was painted by Mary Simons, was called The Bird Catchers. And so what it revealed to us was two men who are described as Muslim bird catchers. And they bring the birds to Elizabeth Gwillim to be painted, and they hold the birds. They swaddle the birds, they feed them, they care for them, they position the birds so she can paint live birds, which is what makes her painting so extraordinary. I mean, she was compared actually by a curator at the ROM, Terry Short, who was the curator of ornithology in the 1980s. He borrowed some of Elizabeth Gwillim's material, and he talked about her as the equivalent of Audubon. But like many women, her work did not get published in the ways that Audubon's did. And we can talk about that another time. But the bird catchers, the natural history was made possible for many Europeans by the collaboration, the active collaboration and knowledge of the people from in the areas in which they were. So this really inspired us to start talking and thinking about how do we look at the collections of natural history, which are often seen as objective collections, but they're not, of course. Natural history, science is not objective in the sense, it's not just about the facts, it's also about perceptions and perspectives. So we have a new project called Hidden Hands in Colonial Natural History Collections. And we've looked at 4 bodies of work in the natural history collections at McGill. And we're looking at how were these collected, and how were these, what were the relationships between the Europeans who depicted material and the indigenous people who often collected the material and made those collections and that new knowledge possible. And we're looking at 4 collections, one from India, a man called James Forbes, working in India in the 1820s. And we're working with the Natural History Society, the Bombay Natural History Society in Mumbai. And again, with Subbu Subramanya, our partner, one of our collaborators on the Gwillim Project. We're working with Sri Lanka and the National Archives of Sri Lanka and looking at a collection of what are called olas, which are palm leaf manuscripts, of which McGill has quite a large collection, all collected in the 1920s by a doctor called Casey Wood, who was extremely interested in Ayurvedic medicine and particularly ophthalmology in India, which had very interesting techniques in ophthalmology. So he collected these, and these are in the library, and we're working with the archives there to translate them and put them online, make them available. We're working as well with the Historical and Geographical Society of Haiti on 4 volumes of watercolors of birds, animals, plants, fish from the 1760s that were done in what was called Saint-Dominique at the period by a French engineer. And there's a lot known about the French engineer, but no one realized he actually was interested in natural history, but he was also getting his information from the people with whom he worked. And so a lot of the material, he has Creole names on it. So we're working with Creole specialists. And finally, we're working with the herbarium collection made by Frances Simpson, the wife of the governor in what was then called Rupert's Land in the Red River area. We're working with the Manitoba Museum in that case, as well as with Gloria Bell, who is a scholar at McGill, a Métis, and we're working with the Métis organizations in Manitoba to think about what were the indigenous ways of thinking about the plants that Frances Simpson's collected. So a lot of sort of looking at behind the collections, but also looking at how is natural history knowledge made possible? How does the kind of a European lens change that? And how can we bring in the knowledge that may have been covered and not made, people weren't aware of, back into the conversation in natural history museums through reclassification and more research on those.
Yeah, thank you. No, exactly. And I want to get back to that point that which you opened and closed to what you just said in terms of pulling back the veil on the perceived neutrality of natural history collections. That must have made for some, let's say, uncomfortable conversations as part of, in terms of setting up the project and setting this out as part of the research agenda.
Well, there's a lot of engagement in natural history museums and collections with those questions right now. And we're seeing it coming from the larger institutions like Kew and the Natural History Museum in the UK, looking at their collections, realizing their colonial antecedents and really rethinking how do we, why are things named the way they are? And so this is a big conversation among taxonomists now. Why do we call everything by Latin names? Why do we call things in English, the language of the collector? What are the ways in which we can incorporate the territory from which things come into the conversation about natural history and bring the history and culture of the territory into natural history and also of the collectors? So this is a big conversation among in natural history right now, among taxonomists, among collections managers, and among interpreters of natural history and researchers. So yeah, it's, maybe it's uncomfortable, but it's also so invigorating, I will say. It makes you rethink all you've learned and take the information you've had and twist it around and look at it in a different way.
Yeah, this is, for me, very often the next museum frontier, how we basically, on the culture side of the nature-culture equation, we have had those discussions for a long time now, and now the nature side, where it was ruled by that perceived objectivity, we now also have these conversations, and it's quite invigorating that we actually, in this way, very much challenging the ontological underpinnings of the way knowledge is constructed through museums, and further pulling back undermining in some ways the foundation upon which museums are founded, and that will be very hard, I think, for a lot of people, very hard to stomach, but it's utterly necessary if you want to proceed.
But it's also exciting, I think, in the fact that it's reliant on material culture and on the very things that museums hold, those collections. Without those, the people who engage with those collections do not necessarily leave written records. So this is a way of getting at knowledge, a different kind of knowledge through the collections. And there's been some fabulous examples of, particularly, I know more perhaps about India right now, but of working in the Indian archives of the botanical gardens to discover the lives of the gardeners and the lives of their lives, because only really the records of the Europeans were kept, but there is a way to get at the lives of the people who made the garden possible. So some very exciting work done in that regard.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. And I'm ready to pivot to another train of thought, but if there's any questions at this point on what we just discussed, I'm welcome to raise your hand, or if not, I'll move right on. Because I'd like to spend a bit of time talking about your exciting work with the Alberta Museum Association, and hello to our friends and colleagues from the AMA. You've worked on an exciting project about Canadian public opinion on museums that had some really interesting insights and learnings, and I would be grateful if you could share some of those.
Well, yeah, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues, Jennifer and Caroline, who are here. And I think someone from the BC Museum Association was here as well. But what is exciting is Reconsidering Museums is a project that grew out of the strategic planning of the AMA. I worked with the AMA over a number of years looking at, their strategic plan. And what we realized is that though the AMA had a very strong strategic plan, people were expressing this real concern that they didn't know how to talk about why were museums important, why should we support them, why should the public support them. And so this became the genesis of a project, this Reconsidering Museums, and Jennifer, Carolyn, and before Megan Patterson is there too. Hi, Megan. Sorry, now who was at the AMA at the time and is now the director of the Royal Alberta Museum. But how do we got funding from the Canada Cultural Innovation Innovation Fund. Sorry, I'm forgetting it. But anyway, the CCIF at any rate, from the Canadian Heritage. And it enabled the AMA to lead a collaboration with the PTMAs and with the Canadian Museum Association, and to engage with Hill and Knowlton Strategies to do a massive national sort of taking the temperature, if you will, of how Canadians thought about museums. I'm a historian by training, so what engaged me a great deal in this was, in fact, that the last great public survey of museums took place in 1973. And this was the museums in the Canadian public. And I'm old enough to remember going in 1975 to Couchiching, to the Couchiching conference, where we discussed the findings from the museums in the Canadian public. And Bob Janes was there too. And Robin was there and a few other people. And it really, Wayne was there. We were extremely young then. And it really changed our ideas on what museums should be. And it really turned it to the museum to the public. So away from really looking at only collections to really looking at how the public use museums. So here we are almost 50 years later, and we do another look at the same thing. So there's an online survey with focus groups, conversations across Canada, coast to coast to coast, but also a national public opinion survey, which was done by Hill and Knowlton. So it's looking really at public opinion, which is different from looking at the opinions of people who are visitors, visitor surveys. And really, were museums important to Canadians? And I think the really good news and the good answer is yes, they are. They were important in 1973. They continue to be important today. And Canadians do value their museums. They see them as important institutions. They understand the work that museums do. And they actually do, and I'm going to use the word trust, though it's an often, and Caroline knows, it's a much discussed word these days. But they do trust museums to give them accurate information, to be where they can go to them to look for accurate information in a world where sometimes, it's difficult to understand or to find, what is the correct information. So this is really important, but there are also a few things that Canadians want museums to do differently.
So what lessons then for museums?
Well, I think, and I'll ask Caroline, Jennifer, and Megan to leap in, but I think, what Canadians are interested in. We asked an interesting question in the public opinion survey. So this is public opinion. This is not necessarily museum goers. About 2/3 of Canadians go to a museum every year. Okay, one museum visit a year. It may not be the same one every time, but they go. So Canadians are museum goers. But I think one of the things that we asked was, what do you think will change in the future? So will the roles of museums, you understand the roles they have today to preserve and to educate, but what will change in the future? And what Canadians said is they want museums to address issues that are critical issues for them today, like the climate crisis. They want information from museums. They also want museums to be more representative of what Canada is today, too. I mean, that's the other really important thing, and that includes reconciliation, it includes diversity, it includes how do we think about heritage, a bit like our conversation, Sascha, about, natural history. It's not just seen from one perspective. So how do we really look at our heritage in Canada and reflect the heritage of Canadians? Because Canadians want that. And then finally and this was encouraging for me, they do want museums to do research. They expect museums to have a larger role in doing research, because I think it goes back to that. They want correct information. They want a source that they can go to find out correct information on significant issues like climate change. I think the other thing I will say too is that, and just going back, Canadians really do understand that museums are there to protect our material culture, our material and natural culture. But a question that we asked and that really came to the fore is that over 80% of Canadians feel museums are there for Indigenous culture, to preserve and present Indigenous culture. And they want the whole story of our history in this country. They don't want just a partial story. So I think it was a very encouraging survey, but also challenging for museums.
Yes, in some ways reassuring, I would think, for if we're affirming what museums might feel say they're comfortable doing already, but at the same time, opening up an exciting path for the future. And now linking this to the work that ICOM Canada is heavily engaged with, is being that organization that is globally engaged on behalf of and for the Canadian museum sector. What role does the global context play in this regard? What suggestion would you have for museums who, based on that type of research, would want to engage globally?
Well, I think for me, there's a couple of areas. One is, in fact, this notion of, our history and our heritage. Like, Canada is one of the most diverse countries in the world, and certainly in its major cities, you can see this. How do we reflect that diverse heritage in our institutions? And that's an ongoing question for museums. But I think a lot of museums are addressing that now. So I don't think that's news to a lot of people. But Canadians want to see what they know of their culture and backgrounds also reflected within the culture and backgrounds of museums. I mean, the National Gallery just got their first Sikh art collection, which I think is pretty interesting too. And I remember when Yen Shur, the director at the time, accepted one of the first Asian collections in the National Gallery. So that adds different issues. It adds new thinking about what is the collection of the museum. I think I think one is on this notion of diverse heritage and how that's reflected. I think the second is, and I'm a historian of natural history, so biodiversity is really important. Canada has a great deal of biodiversity. But what's happening, of course, is that we're linked globally. We cannot, just as we as people cannot disengage ourselves from the larger world, from a biological perspective, we cannot. And Canadian materials is incredibly important in terms of looking at biodiversity and environmental histories, and going forward, looking at species and making sure that Canadian material is there. And then I'm going to just end with something, which is, this is where the digital becomes really important, because Canadian museums must put their collections online. They must share their knowledge and their collections with the world. And the way to do that is through online. And I think this is something I've believed for a long time, since I was back in the 90s and I was at the McCord, and we put a great deal of the McCord collection online. It's up to us as Canadian institutions to make the information our institutions hold available to the global audience. And I know from working with the Gwillim Project how engaged the global audience is in the collections we hold. And I think this is something where we need to make sure that our museums are aware of that, are digitally competent, and able to engage with the world on that platform, as well as through exhibits and programs for the local audience. So it's that kind of local global thing that was there back in the 70s as well.
Yeah, no, very, very exciting. And do you think Canadian museums are quite there yet in terms of the degree and intensity of their global engagement, or do you think there's, you say that there's a bit more work to do?
I think there's a fair bit of work to do, actually. And I think this is not just for Canadian museums. I think surveys over the last couple of years, particularly with the spur of COVID, there's been a number of surveys looking at how digitally ready museums are to engage with audiences, not just globally, but also even locally. And there's a fair bit of work to do. So I think that's a really important issue coming up for Canadian institutions, for North American institutions, to not just get the collections online, but also engage with their publics through the digital, as well as through the experience of museum going. And these things are complementary. They don't negate each other.
And then what then could museums do to, broaden their global reach, apart from working digitally? What else is there? What do we need to do as a sector to jump into that fray?
I think we need to think differently. And I think I certainly know that over the last 20 years, from the perspective of the environment and of the climate crisis and biodiversity, that we really have got to rethink that we are citizens of a larger world, and we're responsible to that too. And I think if we see our institutions in that context, we see that because there's a wonderful Canadian author, Margaret Visser, who wrote a whole series of books on the history of dinner and on different foodstuffs. And she had a wonderful phrase, which I always loved. She said, "Give me a thread, like a thread from a cloth, and I'll unravel the world." And I think that's what we can do in museums. We can take what we think are local stories, and we can pull on them enough, and we find they're not local at all. They are in fact connected. We're connected to a larger world. And I think that's where the research comes in, that we must look at our collections, not just as evidence of, our local scene, but as connected to that bigger world. And I think there's a fair bit of interest in doing that, certainly among historians. And I think young people see that as well. Certainly the young students I've been working with, they are already very engaged that way. They see that they cannot look at history in an isolated perspective. They must look at it in a much broader frame.
And it's hard to ignore the circumstantial factors. We just maybe the end, who knows, of a global pandemic, climate change, migration, and there's lots of other factors looking across the next decade, next century, in terms of level of museums. And it's very hard to compartmentalize it to either local or national expression or national expression. But of course, the question is, for somebody who might be working in a museum that is in the past not engaged with the world in that way, to what extent could that museum be engaged with the world in that way, and what kind of threats to pull out for the work, how to connect local stories to the global. And I like to think about the local global as on a continuum in this regard. And I think what you just said very much resonates with what are the possibilities, what's our duty and responsibility in this sector to engage with those conversations.
I think too, one other thing that I think is truly a global story is, and we talk about in Canada's reconciliation, but it really is our relationship with Indigenous peoples, and that is a global story. And I think the work that Canadian museums must do in reconciliation links them automatically with that larger global story. And we had a good example of that at the CMA conference, the recent CMA conference, where the Maori curator from New Zealand, I'm sorry, I can't remember her name, spoke so eloquently about the work she was doing in New Zealand and how that resonates with the work that must be done in this country. So I think that right there's a theme which is essentially Canadian. Our current history is the history of reconciliation. We must reach out to that. And that automatically brings us into a larger world.
And then the question is, are we sufficiently able to do so? And I would like to talk about National Museums policy in a second, but I would like to spend a moment and just this pivots in that direction about funding that goes in that direction. And you've been enabled in that work that's been doing through research funding for which it is required to engage in those global networks to make the research happen. And of course, partnership grants, partnership development grants, and other grants from SSHRC are very much geared into that direction to make it work in this way. And but then when we look at potential federal and other funding opportunities, that might just not be as encouraging. And I mean, I've been a great fan of opportunities like creative export funding as sort of a starting point to think about these things, or something like the Canada-France agreement that points in the right direction. But I often feel that there's lots out there if you're in the for-profit world. You can export and other kind of programs that allow the kind of matchmaking, the kind of travel to build markets and so on. But for our world, I think there's more more is needed to encourage museums actively in that direction. Wouldn't you agree with that, or am I pushing that too far?
No, I agree with you. And I think it is also taking the opportunities that you can make for yourself. I mean, I look at what the Canada Council has done in this support for artists and arts groups. And certainly by supporting artists, they've been able to make those global reach outs, supporting exchanges. There are ways to support exchange. And I think, again, I'm going to come back to the use of platforms like this. We managed to do an entire international project over 3 years by forced to do it completely online. I have never met any of my partners in the UK, the US, or India. And yet I feel I know them. I feel I have strong friendships developed there. I have invitations to visit. I can hardly wait. But I think it is possible to reach out. And I think even for a small, I mean, Catherine raised the point, and, Canada is mainly about smaller and medium-sized institutions. I think it's very possible. And we see this, I have to say that my husband is a bird watcher, and he's with the local birding club, Bird Protection Quebec. He runs the speakers program. This technology has enabled him to bring in some of the top speakers from all over the world, which have attracted huge local audiences in Montreal and Quebec. I mean, like 150 to 200 people to talks, where previously we used to go and get 20 people. If we were lucky to listen. So I think museums, and I know Megan has instituted a series of talks at Alberta, which I went to a couple of them and I really enjoyed them because interest is a global issue. So if you're interested in things, your interest will bring you, as long as it's available, as long as you make sure people know it's available. And those networks of interest link people together. So I will say, when we did our talk for the Gwillim Project on costume and textiles, we had almost 200 people listening to that talk because of those strong linkages between the costume and dress historians. They came in to listen. And they came in from Australia, they came in from all over the world to listen, to hear this talk, because they were engaged with dress, the early history of dress history. And so I think that there's a real model there for, I think of a museum like Medelta, the Medelta Museum in Alberta. I'm a big collector of Medelta, and I would go to anything they put on, right? I don't have to be like next door. So I think that having those strong thinking about that your audience is not just the people who come in your door. And I think getting away from the notion as well, and I'm going to say very strongly, I've written about this for years, the idea that the government of Canada put in place of user pay. And this is many decades ago. The government of Canada said, well, we'll have taxpayer relief because users will pay. So museums who charge a large amount of money on the mistaken belief that users should pay for the privilege are missing out on engaging larger audiences, not just to local audiences, but also these larger global audiences. So, and I think that's also something we found from the pandemic. People do want content online. And I've certainly been attending a lot of it. Doesn't mean everybody in the world wants it, but it means those with interest will follow their interest and they will find you.
Exactly, certainly change the reach, but not just, and also about who is having the conversation. It allows to have more people around a differently shaped table. And yeah, I found it quite invigorating to be able to actually get people you would otherwise not get to have a conversation with them. I think that's been a great advantage. Now let's pivot a bit to the National Museums policy, because I would like to conclude with that. And I also know that this is a topic dear to the heart of many people in the room here, and please feel free to jump in as well. Now, you already started to talk about the whole notion of a user, and I think that puts us already into a conceptual mind frame in terms of how to think about differently about what this policy should accomplish. What, in your judgment, should be in it, or what should definitely not be in it?
Well, I think I said to you earlier, Sascha, when we had a conversation, of looking back at that era in the 1970s and late 60s. So the 1973 survey of Canadians was in the context of a new national museum policy, which had been declared. And the government wanted to know, I mean, perhaps they should have asked before, but they wanted to know post facto, did anyone really care about museums? And the new national museum policy that was enunciated in 1968 was really based on the government's framework. They had a policy framework, and their policy framework was first and foremost bilingualism and biculturalism, then diversity, regionalism, and more or less equity. They were interested in equity as well. So they had this framework, this policy framework, which they rewrote all the policies that were coming out at the time, including cultural policies, into that framework. And so I think it behooves us to look at what's the current government framework. And, you know, I'm no expert on this and anybody can jump in, but when I look at what has been said in ministerial letters and what the government has enunciated, we know that reconciliation, the climate crisis, and I think diversity, the sort of impacts of migration and it's still equity, are really important to the government. And I think that if we look at a national museum policy, I think it has to be within that kind of framework. It's not just about more money for museums. It's got to be within that framework. So I think a national museum policy that addresses those issues will have the kind of legs that the earlier national museum policy had. I think, too, one of the things to be thoughtful about is that the first national museum policy also declared the national museums, 4 national museums. We now have 7. And the government, I think the federal government, feels its main responsibility is to the national museums. So the national museum policy then is there to give a framework by which funding can be awarded, but also programs can be set forward in different areas. So it's not always just about funding, but I think that if museums themselves can rise to the challenge of some of these big, and they are global issues, like the reconciliation, the climate crisis, biodiversity, diversity, migration, if museums themselves are already rising to it, then the policy, they can work within the government's framework, and the policy will really be there to assist them to address these big challenges, which we know from the survey, Canadians, and particularly younger Canadians, the people who inherit our museums in 20 years, want to see happen.
And what makes it public policy is the work that you spoke to earlier in terms of the Canadian public opinion that then would encourage museums to pivot more consciously in that direction. Before we run up against the clock, I'm wondering whether anybody else would like to chime in or have any questions. You've been awfully quiet. Robin? Please.
Unmute yourself, Robin.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Am I unmuted now?
You are.
Okay. As Victoria said, talking about the first National Museum policy, I don't know if you would agree, but it was very much about beginning to know what the collections were across the country, but also to assist the whole business of exhibition. And so, and I think in the last 50 years, we've been pretty successful in terms of museums of all sizes, you know, doing exhibitions. But I think one of the things that hopefully a new policy or a new thrust would be is to do the sort of things that Victoria was talking about, which is research. And we don't seem to have a mechanism within museums in relationship to provincial programs or national programs of funding to fund research within museums. I think the Canada Council does well with the art galleries and the art museums, but historical museums don't seem to have that same sort of thrust. We've done very well with exhibits, we know our collections, but now these platforms like Zoom and the whole business of the digitizing of the collections opens up, it seems to me, a remarkable opportunity for research, even at the very local level. And then through the platforms like Zoom and the digitalization of the collections, you can basically make particular collections like the one that Victoria, you know, made an international program. I think that can happen. And I'd like to see now that we build on that whole business of knowing more about our collections and doing wonderful exhibits in all over the country, is to now to go into research. And so we can share that knowledge, essentially that knowledge, because museums are about sharing knowledge. to share that knowledge with this wider audience, with these platforms we've found out work so well during COVID.
I think that's true, but I just want to put a little caveat on that, and to make sure that we don't see research only as the purview of the museum scholar. I think one of the things that Hidden Hands taught us, right, or the working with Hidden Hands, is there are lots of different kinds of experience and expertise out there that are valuable to understand museum collections. So I think this is where I would want to make sure that, because I think previously when the museum and the Canadian public came out, museum scholarship was very narrow and very small and very inward looking. And I think now we want to make sure that the knowledge that our collections are based on a broader kind of knowledge, a knowledge which respects, certainly in this country, Indigenous knowledge very importantly, but also seeks knowledge in a number of different ways, and doesn't just restrict itself to a very narrowly defined knowledge base, mainly European. This is, I think, what also came out of the survey is a number of young people, about a quarter of young people, think museums are incredibly Eurocentric. Yeah. So I think I just want to make sure that we realize that the broadening out of thinking about the world demands that we broaden our notion of what research in our collections might be.
Yes, I agree with you. I think that it's just not the museum scholar, the curator, or the museum scholar, but there are people now who have such wide interests, and as you found out, expert knowledge about whether it's about dress or food or how people saw the world in ornithology or whatever, and you broaden it out to a whole group of people who are enthusiasts and have an incredible amount of knowledge. And I think one of the things that museums probably have done reasonably well, but and particularly at the local level, they do, when they do an exhibit or do a publication, they do in fact involve people who are, for example, in North Vancouver, they got this wonderful archive from the British Columbia Mountaineering Association. Well, the whole business of the people who do mountaineering have an incredible sort of knowledge, but they're not necessarily museum or university scholars, but yet they have incredible knowledge about the history of mountaineering and that whole thing. And as a result, exhibits and online material has become much richer.
Yes, thank you. Would anybody else like to chime in on any of the points we discussed today? Like, open up a new line of thought before I have to unfortunately end.
I just want to make sure.
If not, yeah.
Okay, well, I just have one thing to say. I just want to make sure too, with Carol and Megan and Jennifer here, to understand the important work of listening to what the public says. I really think you need to listen, not just to the people who visit, because your visitors tend to be people who are kind of already like you, but to really trying to get at the notion of what the public, of public interest. And some of that can come, I think a bit as Robin said, it comes in unexpected places. And I think really, what is the Canadian public engaged with right now? What are the big issues for the Canadian public right now? And I think you can survey, you can look at news, you can think about how to find out about, what are those currents that are sweeping through the Canadian public, and then how can the museum address them? Maybe it can, but I think that it's not good enough to be just interested in what the visitors, and Sascha, that goes back to a bit the user pay, right? If you're only catering to your users, you get more and more of them, but you don't get anybody else.
Thank you. And I think that's a wonderful note to conclude on, and with an embedded call to action. Thank you so much, Victoria, and congratulations again on the award. It was such a joy to speaking with you, and thank you all for joining us. I'd like to also thank Sarah Khan for making all this work logistically today. So thank you very much for Sarah. And I look forward to seeing you all in different fora in the coming years. And thank you very much for joining us. And this, as Elka mentioned, this is sort of the first ICOM Canada webinar of the year. And as ICOM Canada, what we're trying to do is to now pushing out a series of events throughout the year to to try to foreground, bring to play the ICOM Canada voice in the Canadian museum sector, and so you will hear more from us. So thank you for tuning in today. Thank you for being an ICOM Canada member, and I wish you all a wonderful afternoon, evening, or middle of your day, depending on where you are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you again for this award.
Congratulations again.